Hello and welcome to the aForm Show, the premier podcast for all things architecture and design across the MENA region. Welcome to your tribe. Hello and welcome to the show, everyone. This week, we are joined by Peter Jackson, an architect who has been responsible for some of the most pivotal projects across the Emirate of Sharjah, with a varied portfolio across 2 continents. Peter has also dedicated much of his career to the study and preservation of historic buildings. In this episode, we go on a journey through Peter's key projects, his inspirations, and most importantly, his next chapter in life. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the show again, Peter Jackson. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I couldn't see how we could not. The last time we had you on, that was a revelation of an episode, if I were to put it mildly. I think it resonated with a lot of architects that practice in the region. And I'm hoping in this episode, we can dive a little deeper into some of the subjects that we spoke about. Most importantly, about this book that I have sat next to me. For those who probably cannot see us, if you can maybe quickly introduce the book that I'm talking about and why this exists and why was it done, rather?
Well, the book is Wind Tower. It was first published in 2007 and has been republished in the 2020s in new expanded English and very specially the Arabic format, which was always the ideal of my co-author and I, Anne Coles, that it should be locally accessible. It started when I'd met Anne while I was a student, and the project started when I came out to spend 6-7 weeks here working for John Harris in 1974. I was actually looking after his office while the partner was on leave. We'd just moved out of the Rashid Hospital into an apartment office in Dera overlooking the creek, and I brought with me a letter of introduction from Anne to a family, to a Fikri family, asking if they could give me access to a wind tower house so that I could do a measured drawing of a wind tower. I brought the letter and they were very welcoming in the souk. Said, come back the next day. So I came back again after work, and they had a young teenager with them saying, Rashad will take you across to a house, his family house. And we always assumed it was a Fikri house for many, many years. I walked into this house and I was awed by its beauty, by its structure, by the way the space was structured and so on, its decoration. It was all so unlike the architecture that I knew in Europe, or mainly in Britain. It was just something different, and I wanted to understand it. And it also had 3 wind towers, so I didn't know which one to measure. So I asked Rashad if it would be possible to measure the whole house. So I think after that preliminary visit, he asked his family, and they said, yes, you can measure the whole house. So I carried out this survey after work for a couple of hours early evening before it got dark, and it was over 3 weeks, February 1974. Went back to London with all these sketches and measured drawings, and then I had to sort of piece it together, as well as doing my Part 3, studying for my Part 3 exams and attending lectures, working full time and trying to have a little bit of social life as well. So I'd get up early every morning and try and spend an hour or 2 drawing. It took me a year to put all the drawings together. John Harris sponsored Anne and I writing a short monograph for art and archaeological research papers, which was the first time I think a wind tower house had been sort of published and publicized in the UK. Yeah, first time at all. And we were also asked by the Architectural Review to do an article. So that was really the beginning of my writing career. But in 76, I went, instead of coming back to Dubai, I wanted to get some different experience. And I went to Zambia to work for someone who had been recommended to me, a completely crazy, wonderful architect who I learnt so much from. It was like going back to university. So Africa took over my life for the next 26 years, most of which was in my own 22 years in my own private practice in Zimbabwe. When I came back in 2002, because of the terrible economic and political situation that had evolved under Mugabe, brought my family here. After a couple of weeks, I went to a seminar at the American University here in Sharjah to meet the head of the historic building section, who were restoring what was left of the Bastakia, roughly half of it. And when I was introduced to the chair of the seminar, Rashad Bukash, he looked at me and said,
"Have we met
Are you
before?"
my first teacher?" Which left me a bit, I wasn't sure. I was a bit disorientated. And he went on, he said, "Did you measure my father's house?" Sounded a sort of a bit biblical. And
are you the one?
And he said, "You don't recognize me, do you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I don't recognize you either, but I've been looking for you for all these years on the internet. And I'm the boy who held the end of your tape when you measured my father's house."
Wow.
It wasn't a Fikri house, it was a Bukash house.
Wow.
Now that, and that's why part of the reason he became an architect, that experience. And he tells the same story from his viewpoint. And you never know quite how your life touches someone else's. I got back to my hotel apartment. I still wasn't fully settled as I was getting to work in Dubai, and sent off a very long email to Anne Coles and told her what had happened. And then when I went over in the summer, I went to see Anne and said, look, this is an amazing opportunity. We can't
pass it up.
We can't pass it up. We've got to do something about it. And so we planned that with Rashad's support from the municipality side, giving us access to the archive of the historic building section, drawings and so on. And Rashad was wonderful and did so. And so that was 2002, 2003. It took quite a long time to put the book together. And one of the motivations was to capture the memories of the last generation that lived in the houses. And that was really important to us. Anne knew the ladies. She'd been involved at the helping Bibia Sharifi set up the women's club and working with them. And just, again, looking at Windhouse, trying to see how they worked, just with very, today, primitive methods, but they were state-of-the-art science in those days, but 100%. Very slow. And so we had access to the majlises. And I was treated as an honorary woman. I could attend because I wasn't Muslim.
Right.
I was a foreign. And we built up all these interviews which really taught me that architecture is a skeleton on which communities built. Architecture is not the end in its own right, which we as architects see we focus on buildings as objects. But I think doing the research, working with Anne subsequently, and then with Alan Jones doing the wind tower measurements and research to see how the wind towers work themselves, I realized that, the architecture is just a part of the story. It's not the end in itself. As beautiful as it is, it reflects the culture. It works for the culture. It's a product of that culture, but it's not sort of art pieces in a landscape.
Yeah.
So it was a very profound experience for me putting it together. And what was interesting is that 15 years later, after the first edition came out, I was then approached by the community and saying, look, can these families contact you? They're very disappointed that they weren't included in the first edition. Now, this happened to be at the time of COVID, around 2000, and, interviews were severely restricted purely to online meetings. But it gave the opportunity to introduce a new realm to the book. Anne's focus in her studies at Oxford were gender studies. So she was very interested in the lives of the families, the women in the house, because they managed the household. I'd always wanted to see how the men came into the story, what they did outside of the house as well. And that's the new chapter that came into the new edition. And so when it then went to an Arabic edition, the community really taken over. So it's no longer Anne's and my project. This is a community project.
Yep.
It's their memories. It's their records. They've sponsored the translation. They've sponsored the second edition. They've sponsored the translation. It's come out of their wanting to do it. What I'm seeing now is students at the university wanting to know more about their history and, their architectural history and the family history. And we've got a new researcher who's one of the prominent families from the El Bastakia in Al Fahidi. And he is now doing a virtual reconstruction of his family house. It's going online. He's researching his history, and his motive is he's doing it for his mother. She said she would like to see her old house again.
Wow.
And he's making that possible. It was demolished at the same time as a Bukash house in 1985.
Right.
So, if the Wind Tower has spurred that sort of research into the future, that architecture students or just family historians, pick up the baton and go on running with it. It doesn't apply just to Bastakia, it's to local history.
Yeah.
So it's very satisfying or gratifying to feel, that not only have we captured the stories we did, but that more are going to be captured. Yeah. The problem now, of course, is, it's another generation. You'll get the stories are going to be second and third hand. We were very lucky to get last first hand.
Yeah. It has been a very pivotal book without question. To kind of maybe add on to how it's impacted sort of the community, it is one of the very first books I ever bought as an architecture student. As fate would have it, Rashad Bukash actually taught a course at the university I was in around conservation. And it was the first time I actually got a bit of, obviously we did a couple of walkthroughs in Bastakia and so on, but to actually get the nuances of how these things were put together, why they were done the way they were done, and how it varied from house to house and why it varied, etc., etc. It was only after that course, and of course during the process of that course, finding your book, it impacted me because I found that there were a lot of quote unquote advanced technologies, I would say, that were really incorporated and really defined the vernacular, so to speak, sort of breaking this idea of if you're in the desert, you need to be having cooling and things like that. So much so that it actually went on to influence my graduate thesis, which was climate responsive Emirati housing, where obviously the wind tower played a very significant sort of role, not just in the actual house, but more in a Barjeel context and a much more sort of master plan context, even, so to speak. So I suppose my question very selfishly to you would be, for the architects who know that the wind tower worked, it still works in a sense, why do you think it's disappeared or not really resurging as a passive cooling strategy in 2026, so to speak?
It's a good question. And the company that we worked with to do the measurements and so on, they have their offices near Melbourne in Australia, Port Melbourne, and they have actually incorporated passive cooling using wind tower systems, not with wind towers, more wind scoops, and using air circulation to cool their buildings successfully. It's laboratories as well, so and it works. And we know from our research that we did with them that they achieve comfort levels if you were non-active.
Right.
So you had to be resting.
Right.
And it gave you enough cooling through air movement, the evaporation of perspiration, sweat from your skin to keep you cool in the hottest time of the day. But you had to be non-active. So,
right.
And it fitted local culture of resting after you had after Dua prayers and your meal, and then you rested until 3.
Yeah.
So till the next prayers. And they didn't work in the evenings. They worked when the wind came off the sea in the afternoons. They didn't work when the wind came from the desert because the desert wind was hot and dusty, and dirty. So I'm sure there was always a lot of cleaning every day under the wind towers. And of course, in winter, they were closed. And when they opened them again, it was extremely dirty because the wind tower was full of bird droppings and sand and so on. So they have, although they work, they were limited. They were all that was available, if you like. And they used every opportunity that the builders had wind scoops in the walls, the split walls, so that the wind would hit part of the wall and then drop, into the room sideways. So the wind tower was just part of that system. They are really not very good for the lifestyle we live today. They worked very well in the traditional lifestyle and before there was electricity or what have you. They are dirty, and of course you've got security issues. And also we now have a very material world. We don't want our computers and stuff to get coated and filled with sand and dust. We create now sealed environments. But I do agree with you that there's not been enough research here on its application. And certainly VIPAC were really interested in the combination of natural wind flow and supplementing with heat pumps. So you introduce a sort of technology between the natural. But I've never incorporated it into my own buildings because I don't understand it enough, and I try and make them very sensitive to the climate and, orientation and so on, and using insulation. But it is disappointing that it hasn't been more explored. And the wind tower now is used as a decorative element, often to hide water tanks and cooling equipment, but not as a wind tower anymore.
Yeah, that's actually quite sad. Whenever I see that, I'm like, you might as well just leave it alone. like there's no need to incorporate it in these weird proportions and kind of just have these little anyway.
No, when I first came to Dubai, it was still very dominated by the wind towers, and especially Bur Dubai, the Bastakia and Al Fahidi, the Souk. There were a lot of wind towers there. A lot had already gone.
Yeah.
They were very imposing. They gave the town part of its character. And similarly, Bahrain, Sharjah.
True.
Yes.
I think there is a lot of exploration now happening over the last few years. I think there's been this, specifically I'm referring to this competition of the House of the Future, which has been happening, and we sort of participate every year, and it's always awesome to see the entries that have gone in. And I think from what I saw in this year's entries, if you were to sort of collate a common theme, everyone was sort of pushing the wind towers, which was fascinating. Both, like you said, from a technology point of view, running simulations to actually see how different materiality would actually impact how this actually works and cools, integration of pumps, having water beds that the air sort of goes down, collects under, then filters into the house. So I'm confident that it might show up again in a meaningful way. I
think it will. It needs committed research. And of course, the UAE could afford that. It will happen, but not in the way that we saw it, pre-oil, vernacular architecture. And it was the only way people could keep cool in a hot sunny afternoon before there was electricity, before there were fans. So they were very, very important.
True. I want to then maybe quickly switch gears and jump to Sharjah. In my opinion, one of the best kept secrets for every architect is the Emirate of Sharjah. It tends to be glossed over at times, I feel, whenever architects visit the country. It's typically, Dubai and maybe Abu Dhabi. But in my opinion, I think some of the best architectural work is in Sharjah, both from a heritage point of view, also from a modern point of view. I think areas, Buhais, for example, the Geology Park is one of my favorite buildings. House of Future, of course. And there are many of these gems kind of all across the Emirate. But one that I've recently sort of had to tell people is the heart of Sharjah, which again, I'll leave it up to you. If you could sort of introduce it and tell the architects listening in, what exactly is that project? Why should they go there? What were you trying to do with it?
Well, the Heart of Sharjah was a term I coined on a proposal for a heritage museum when I discovered, before I joined the ruler's office, and it's actually the reason I was invited to join Sharjah government, was my concern and interest trying to give alternatives to the throughway, the motorway that was being planned along the Corniche, separating the old town from the port, from the water, from the creek, which was the old port that served it, by putting in, that was being proposed, a big 6-lane throughway.
Yeah.
So there was it actually cut all linkages, all pedestrian linkages, and destroyed visual linkages between the town and the reason it was there, which was the creek and being a port. The raison d'etre for Sharjah being located, it just seemed completely wrong, to be celebrating these museums and letting road engineering, destroy the character of this old area. And very soon into my tenure in the office, we commissioned Dar Al Omran to carry out a master plan. And I worked very closely with them. We had collaborators as well from the American University and so on. And the master plan was developed. Heart of Sharjah is not a project. Heart of Sharjah is a series of projects. It wasn't a massive redevelopment. It takes place, in little bits and pieces. And His Highness the ruler, has his ideas developed, and, he comes along and it gives instructions for some buildings to be demolished. Sheikh Ahur from the Arts Foundation, wants to preserve a good part of the modern intruding architecture because it's part of Sharjah's history, and quite rightly. So it's an ongoing dialogue, if you like, between the various interested parties, heritage, arts, and commercial. Sharouk have been very involved. And the first instruction that I got was about the souk. The souk was becoming very dilapidated and a big fire risk. The shop fronts all looked very modern, but it was traditional construction, sea stone, coral behind. And it was an evolving, organic place, so different to the shopping malls that now dominate our city and lives here.
It is one of the very first early places that I have as a memory as a child, because we used to stay in Sharjah at that point of time. So one of the earliest memories I have is actually running through that souk, which is obviously, if you see it now, it's completely different. But I understand completely.
Well, His Highness Sheikh Sultan gave us an instruction to cover souk Sakar, which originally had gates, and he wanted the gates reconstructed as he remembered as a boy.
Right.
And the problem was that the souk in the 1950s had been widened to allow vehicles to get through. So the front of the shops had been demolished and they've been extended the back towards the creek. And you can see that line where they were extended. It's still visible. So we started off with the Department of Culture and Heritage. I established a historic buildings unit with architects with conservation background, engineers and so on, to work specifically on conservation work. And working with the courses that ICROM was now providing regionally, but based in Sharjah, on construction methods and conservation methods. We took the project forward. The first thing we did was took off the road surface, the tarmac that was there, just to find the outline of the original souk, and which we found. But we didn't archaeologically excavate it. We just exposed the walls so we knew where they were. We then covered it up, and we rather than enclose the souk and air condition it, which was His Highness's initial instruction, we didn't want to touch the fabric of the souk. We didn't want to harm it.
Right.
We didn't want to sort of reconstruct it like has happened at, for instance, Souk Al Arsa, and then building an artificial roof over the souk. We wanted to keep the character of it and touch the souk lightly with foundations that didn't spoil any potential archaeology underneath. So we built it with a light steel frameworks that could be got into very tight spaces. Some of them, were quite difficult to get into. And we used a twin skin roof, solar reflecting curved roof at the top, draining through through gutters and a rainwater pipe which ran inside the columns on one side, and then we took power for fans and lights on the other column. So we had to incorporate storm drainage and what have you. And the top roof overhung, and the bottom roof, about a metre below it, was arish. So it was the same material as had always been in the souk, but framed into this modern frame. And the frame sort of ran through the souk, changed where it had to, changed direction, changed width where it needed to, without touching the existing buildings. And the souk never shut for a day during this, even during the repaving, putting in the storm drainage and so on. The souk stayed open. And when we finished that first phase of it, they started upgrading the shop fronts. To go with it. His Highness then asked us to extend to Souk Mohammed, which was next to it, going towards Bank Street. And while we were doing that, I met Southampton University, who were doing ground radar studies, archaeological studies. And I said, could you look at Bank Street? Because I'm really intrigued, because it cut through the souk, in the end of the 60s. So they did a ground radar survey and showed the outline of buildings. And we used that as a basis. They had to close Bank Street for the period of doing it.
I can imagine. Yeah.
We weren't very popular, I don't think.
All the bankers would have been like, what are these guys doing?
Well, then it got worse, because His Highness then approved that we could actually do an archaeological excavation, which we did. Dear. We did with the archaeology department with Hanai and Tatsuo Sasaki, who've done a lot of digs for us here in Sharjah, Emirate. And so we cut it all up for a period. And we had real problems because of the tide going in and out and the foul water that, had accumulated underground, black, filthy stuff. So we then had to put in pumps and pump it all out. And that excavation went on for a few months. And once we got the results, it was sort of covered up. But Shahrukh then very positively reconstructed that section of souk that was missing across Bank Street, closed the end of Bank Street and restored the original Sharjah souk, because it was a very long souk. I remembered coming here in the 70s, going through the souk. As you say, running your memory, your childhood memory. And so the souk was restored. Although the central section now is a reconstruction, they'd kept one of the shops, left the excavation exposed, so you can see the old shop fronts. I was hoping we'd get back to the middle of the 19th century or so with the excavation. We didn't find anything older than the end of the 19th century, maybe back to 1890.
Right.
And what we did find is that most of the structures were arish. It was post holes everywhere for arish structures, palm structures. And only really the waterfront was very solid masonry, and the souk themselves, the stores. At the same time, the Arts Foundation were restoring the houses for use as museums and galleries. And then the Mona al-Mustafi, with Gaj, as the architects of record, then built those wonderful complex of art buildings, which filled in where we were originally going to do the Heritage Museum. And they created, I think, one of the best contemporary interpretations of a heritage site in a very modern way, keeping the scale, incorporating some of the traditional materials, but creating courtyards. Sometimes the courtyards were inside the gallery, and sometimes the courtyards were celebrated as open spaces. The scale of it is good. You can go up on the roof. It's a very exciting bit of very simple architecture, very unpretentious, and it fits in so well to the tradition. So again, it's an early phase. It'll go on evolving.
Right.
And then there was Beit Hotel, which Gaj took some of the important houses.
Yeah.
So it's an evolving project. Al-Hisn, we also did a lot of work on Al-Hisn to restore it, although it was a reconstructed fort close to its original position in the middle of Bank Street.
Right.
It needed repair and also a more sensitive use to its materials using lime mortar and so on. So we did all that working with Sharjah museums.
Right. I think there's a lot to be said about, I wouldn't use the word restoration per se, but there's a lot to be said about evolving in the correct direction. I think the souk's a good example of that, wherein just a sort of intervention from yourselves probably has now set it on a path where it'll kind of evolve or adapt. The word correctly is not right, but kind of like evolve and adapt the way that it should, rather than just kind of be dominated by quote-unquote engineers, so to speak.
Well, yeah, and it could. Even our design for the roof evolved, because in the first section, we were really constrained. We were, there was no way you could get cranes in, for instance. So all of the trusses, they had to be trusses that you could put in by hand. Later phases, where those trusses became very visible from the side, as you got to Bank Street, they weren't very pretty. So we evolved, and we worked with Bureau Happold and got a very elegant structure that could be craned in, and that was quicker as well. So the design was evolving and adapting to the circumstances that were available. And of course, for Souk Chinasir, which was being built from scratch, they were also totally appropriate there. And then they continued on through the southern end of the souk. It is now complete.
Right.
There are older parts of the souk, slightly on different alignments, that are still to be excavated and explored. And that's where I hope we'll find the earlier 19th century souk will show itself.
Reveal itself.
Thank you. Yes.
Fascinating. I'm almost tempted to ask, across such a diverse career or a diverse portfolio across so many different contexts and scales and typologies and so on, are there any projects which come to mind which you think our audience should hear about, know about, probably visit, and why so? What do those projects mean to you? Is there a top 2, top 3? I mean, I don't even know how one would even catalog that.
Well, in Zambia, this is now going back to the late 70s. At the end of the 70s, before I moved to Zimbabwe in 1980, I was approached by a Danish friend. He was a Danish volunteer working in one of the high-density township areas, Garden. And the political party, UNEP, wanted to put up a trade school. So we worked, and there was very little money. The Danish embassy brought in equipment, carpentry tools and so on. It was very much, for practical training for the young community. We built it for almost nothing. My office, Montgomery Elfield Kirby, were very generous in letting us use there. I drew it in my spare time, built it, designed it to a sort of modulars, so the minimum number of blocks had to be cut. We try it with, steel framed roofs, which it was what today you would call sustainable. The term wasn't used then. But it was very minimal, and it was done totally by the local community. They bought the materials, they hired the labor and so on, this direct labor methods, but also making it as a nice place, using color and just very simple architecture. Caring about the steelwork, caring about the relationship between the frame and the enclosure.
Simple things like even the way that, where joints are located and things like that.
Absolutely. And that was the trade school. Then they did a production unit so that where the students could then go and work. This was after I was in Zimbabwe, and I did some more drawings for it. And this time we were using gun poles because there was even less money. They were using gun poles and blockwork. I went back there in 2014. I went to look at some MOK building, Montgomery, the people I worked for. And I then went with them to have a look at this trade school. It had expanded. They used the same color scheme. Okay. Although they didn't know me, they knew who I was, they remembered. And they were so happy about the building. Now, if you can go back to a building that was from, say, 1980 to 2014, 35 years later, and the building is still very low cost. I mean, it should be cracked and falling down. It wasn't. It was being loved and expanded, and they really cared for it. And I took the lessons of that into our practice in Zimbabwe, and we did a lot of low-cost schools. Daniko School on the edge of Harare comes to mind, and I visited that 2 years ago. And again, although it wasn't so well maintained, they knew who I was, and they gave me a show around, and the buildings are still standing. Now that's 45 years ago. And they're low cost. They're single skin concrete block buildings. But because they were detailed, the steel could moved, didn't crack the blockwork. And, it was all articulated and just carefully thought out at the design stage. Problem is, as architects, there's no money in that work at all, because you're every saving you make, you're cutting yourself, cutting your fees, but you don't do it for that. You do it because it's important for the community. So our commercial jobs had to cover that. The office buildings and so on we did mean that the office could sustain these low-cost jobs. Rural markets we did. Then in Sharjah here, I particularly love the Islamic Botanic Garden at the Desert Park. This was designed and built in 4 months, 4.5 months, including the exhibition and landscaping. And it was there for Sharjah being the capital of Islamic culture, which was announced in March 2014. His Highness came to us on the 31st of October 2013
Come on, boys.
Asked for it. I spent a week sketching. At the end of that week, we appointed a contractor. We didn't have any construction drawings, but we involved the contractor in the construction decisions. What was going to be steel framed? It had to be, it's going to have to be built very quickly. What was going to be concrete framed and so on. And we agreed a sort of division of labor between traditional construction of concrete frame and blockwork and
steel
structures. No ceilings in the steel structures, exposed. You build it one time. That comes with all sorts of problems. Where do you put the services?
Exactly.
And so we tackled all of those. And it was really satisfying that everyone worked as a team. The architects, the engineers, the contractors, the people actually supplying, the specialist suppliers, Arabian Profiles in that case, getting the window contractors, the glazing and so on. The plan was sketched by His Highness in that first meeting. So I had to follow that plan. And that the plan of the exhibition areas, what he didn't show, there's a diagram, was all the stuff on the main stuff of the building, which was, the offices and the cafeteria and so on. But he knew exactly how he wanted the Islamic garden to be seen. And also then helped us with planting from the palace. Municipality came into landscaping. But it had to be designed. It all had to be drawn.
Can I ask maybe just, again, a bit of a selfish question, because this is something which I kind of struggle with, wherein it does sound very romantic to an extent to hear of multiple disciplines working together harmoniously, everyone getting the message, sort of rallying behind what the vision is and so on and so forth. That does not happen very often. In fact, I would argue it happens very rarely, to be honest.
Doesn't happen on my project. My projects, almost all of them, relied on that same sort of cooperation.
Right. So then,
it's really important that when you're doing projects that are really sensitive in the environment, and you mustn't damage the environment, you've got to have contractors who really understand that, and they don't do more damage to the site than if you hadn't done the project.
Exactly.
And the Islamic garden created us some relationships which have continued, until I retired last week. And the contractor was amazing. Hardco, recommend them to anybody. They do go much further than you expect a contractor to go.
Yeah.
And as I say, it was very good involving them in the design stage. That only really happened on that one project because the program was so extreme.
Super tight. Yeah.
Super tight. It was, part of it was 24-hour working. We met on site at 7:00 every morning, every day.
Right.
Apart from the week I went on leave at Christmas.
Right.
And that's actually one of the favorite buildings I've designed, because I've only designed 2 while I've been in charge, and that was one of them.
Right.
The others, I've been very involved in design as a design manager and client representative. And, I'm not an easy person to please. Then, of course, Buhace, the 2 projects we did with Hopkins Architects, really amazing firm to work with. And what a pleasure to take Sir Michael and Lady Patty Hopkins, around the site.
Yeah.
And sadly, he's no longer with us. And that is an amazing piece of architecture in the landscape.
100%. Every time I have someone who is architecturally inclined, that's typically my first stop. And on paper, it seems like a hard sell, because I quite literally have to be like, yeah, so it's a museum and it's really, really good. And they're like, okay, what's in the museum? Is it artwork? Is it?
Well, it's not really a museum, Alan. It's an interpretive center, and it's there to get you to take, so you can go on the journey through the rocks, the path through the rock. That path through the rocks into the edge of the mountain, to edge of the cliff, that took the whole period of construction to get that without doing any damage either side.
Yeah.
And again, the contractors were amazing. They didn't need supervising to do that.
Right.
That was the most difficult job in a way. It's an interpretive center. So when you go on site, you know what you're looking at. And I got very involved in editing the movie that introduces it and how that's presented. And I won't spoil it for people who've not seen it.
Yeah.
And that was where, I could really interfere with the architects and to their chagrin. But it works. And you don't almost need anything else if you've taken that film in. It tells you what you're going to see. So interpretive centers are really a lot of what I've been involved in, the last 10 years with the Environmental Protected Areas Authority, EPAA, particularly at the Sharjah Safari Park. Another big ask of His Highness back in 2015. How do you turn 8 square kilometers of gravel plain in the desert into African savanna meaningfully? And, irrigation was clearly really important. We had to have huge volumes. We had 10,000 cubic meters of TSE coming up from Sharjah works.
Crazy.
Every day, 10,000 cubes every day. And it must be a happy park because the animals are breeding. The elephants, their herd has grown by almost 50% since we got it.
Wow.
The giraffes are getting even a higher rate of reproduction.
Right.
And the buck there. And these different environments we had to create. So from an architectural side, there were buildings in a landscape. And again, they're either facilities like a cafeteria or they're interpretive. Facilities also includes toilets as well as introductory ticket offices and all of that. But luckily, it happened to be design manager, happened to be someone, who spent 26 years in Africa. So I was and I had looked very hard at a lot of those vernacular architectures.
Yeah.
And we had a firm from South Africa, done all the thatching and so on. And they could do all the different types of thatching, the different styles of thatching, which is great. But essentially, that park, and it is a park, it's an environment you go through. When you go game watching in Zimbabwe, Zambia, or South Africa. Sometimes you don't see anything. You might see birds. You will see something, but you don't see what you wanted to go out and see. You don't see the big five. And it's the same in that park. There's a lot of space for the animals to roam, and you have a very similar experience to going on safari.
Right.
I was told it's the largest African safari outside of Africa, and I'm not sure if that is true, but I'm assured it is. So
I must confess that I haven't been there, but it is very quickly going to be on the top of my list.
It is not good. You go there for the day.
Yeah.
And it's it's evolving. There'll be more buildings in the future. But we've set the rules for it.
Yeah.
And the last project I'm really just finished was the Sharjah Marine Research Centre in Khor-Fakkan for the University of Khor-Fakkan. And that was on a moon site, even more than Jebel Bahais. That was in the quarry. The site His Highness gave us was the quarry, the stone out to build the port of Khor-Fakkan, container port. It was a piece of wrecked landscape.
Moon site is a very good term to describe it. Yeah.
And it was unusual because of it being marine research. They needed a harbour facility. They needed pontoons. We had to build breakwaters. So while the main building was under design by Arup and ATI, architects and engineers, who saw it through, and we opened it in October. But during the design stage of it, we were already on site constructing the harbour facility and blasting the basement hole out of the rock because it was a quarry. So, any trenching and basement had to be blasted, and also to shape the edge of the quarry to make the cliff face safe. And the building used that stone as a facing to be sea resistant at the ground floor. Then we used a very non-corrodable titanium zinc for the curved, like the hull of a ship, for the superstructure. And we've got a super happy client there. So it was a really nice project, really, to close my working career here and established a close relationship too with Exeter University, who got very involved in the research and helped write the brief. Again, very complex project like a hospital. Got aquatic life support systems. It's got a pipe going out to sea, a few hundred meters, bringing in the seawater that then has to be filtered. Got to make sure it's oil-free and so on. And the tankers off the coast, they're very dirty. And the occupants are so happy because they have now got, it's been made a protected area, the sea area outside, and they go out and they see sharks, multitude of sharks, 30 turtles they recorded one day, rays, and now it's protected from fishing. They've got it on the doorstep, which is perfect for student training before they go out and do deeper research work. So that's been I've really enjoyed that job.
I think for anyone listening in, if you have not been inspired by the work that we've spoken about, you're probably in the wrong field. Because, these are by definition not projects which, number one, come along very often. And number two, even if they do come along, are not always done with the intent and the quality which they should be. And at least as a person who's pretty much spent his entire life here, I am quite grateful for these kind of projects more than anything else, because I think that they help define what architecture could be here when done correctly. Because I think there is many circumstances where, in my opinion, architecture is pushed for no particular reason. And it's kind of more vanity than it is anything else. But I think especially something like the Bahais project, I keep coming back to that because it's just the way that it's put together, the way that the services kind of act as the design. You can clearly tell that the engineers there worked with the architects and the engineering is part of the design. It's not just someone stuck up a couple of ducts on the ceiling and, that's it. It clearly had a lot of love put into it. And I think those are the kind of projects we need more. So I suppose this is a thank you for all the work that you've done. You did mention that Khor-Fakkan was kind of a bookend of some sort. The very obvious question would be, what's the next chapter? Is there one that you're planning on writing?
Well, there's all sorts of opportunities. I think first and foremost now I need to properly establish a home in Lübeck in Germany with my wife. We have a lovely house. We've been modifying it, adjusting it. It's an old house in the World Heritage Site. It's on the island of Lübeck, a very beautiful medieval town. And so I have to take 50 years of my life here from Africa, from Dubai, from Sharjah, and somehow get all that, squeeze it into that house, which is on 7 levels. Every room is on a half flight. of stairs. So that's a challenge.
Okay.
Those stairs are either going to kill me or keep me alive. I have family and grandchildren, family in Australia, grandchildren in Cape Town, and my wife's sons and her grandchildren in Dresden and Marburg. So our family are very scattered. So it's going to be, now I'm not restricted to, although they were very generous holiday times, we can now spend a bit more time if we wish to.
Yeah.
We can spend a few months at a time with family. I really want to keep a foot in the door here in Sharjah and have some sort of ongoing relationship through education or research. So, I've got feelers out. But first, before that, I've actually got to get to Germany. I also need to get residency, because since Brexit, I'm not allowed to live there.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I've got to have A1 level German, which I don't think will be difficult for me now. I've been speaking just about enough. I have to pass an exam. And travel. Yeah, there are still places. I spent the first half of my working life exploring Africa, the Africa region, from Egypt and Cape Town. And I flew a lot, so we could fly. We used to fly to Mozambique and down to and across Namibia, Botswana. So I left Africa with a good knowledge of that. Obviously have developed a good knowledge of the UAE, seen it develop the last 24 years with that hindsight as well of having been here in the 70s. So next, I really want to explore more of Europe, the culture from where I came. And I have been doing that really, in my spare time, just as a hobby.
Yeah,
particularly
kind of
looking at
smaller pockets, I would think.
Yeah, looking at Palladio's buildings and the Renaissance. How did the Renaissance get to Northern Europe? How did it define the architecture, the beautiful gabled architecture of Europe, the Hanseatic architecture, which we see in Holland and Northern and the Baltic? So there's a lot to do. I'm still a student, Alan. That's not going to change.
Of course.
I don't have answers. I'm still studying.
Part of me was almost going to ask, so are you going to put the sketchbook down? But I don't think you're going to. I think it's going to be kind of on the side of your hip.
One of the things I really want to do now is write. I've got a lot of memories.
Dare I ask, it's not fiction, is it?
No.
Okay, just checking.
No. I've had so many experiences in my working life and, studying, and I just would like to bring it together. My father wrote mainly for me and for the grandchildren, my sister as well. He wrote, eventually, under lots of prodding, he wrote his recollections, he called them. And so I'd like to do that for my grandchildren and their children in the future, because I think I've had an interesting life. But also, I've got quite a lot of thoughts about architecture, and maybe parts of it could be published, as a life in architecture.
Yeah.
But so far, I've always written in my spare time. Now, potentially, I've got a lot more spare time, which will give me time to write, be thoughtful. I'm taking back all sorts of old correspondence, I've accumulated now. We forget the details of stories and events. And I having lived through some very interesting times as well, the war with Rhodesia, when I lived in Zambia and we were being bombed by the Rhodesian Air Force, and our bridges blown up, and the post office in Lusaka was blown up. And then seeing the rebuilding of Zimbabwe out of the ashes of Rhodesia. And of course, I was here at the birth of the United Arab Emirates, or a month after. And, from that uncertainty of the future, seeing what is this amazing miracle that the UAE is. And also, I've got a lot of thoughts on the way that, it's being designed by engineers and road engineers. And, really, people come second in a lot of places. So I've got quite a lot to say about that. And also the experience with these wonderful projects. As you say, I've been very privileged to be able to do projects directly for the ruler of Sharjah, whose objectives for education and culture, as high as they can be. So, I've been very lucky and very privileged. So I would like to share some of that, if only with my family, the family of the future. So writing is very high on my list.
Nice. Peter, I think this has been, again, just like our last episode, at least for me, it is almost like looking at a cross-section of time when I speak to you, because there is just so much depth in the kind of work that you've done and so much passion wherein it's infectious, to be honest. And I'm hoping that that's translated to a lot of people listening, because I think that's what our industry needs. It almost feels odd to refer to you as an architect. You're almost like an institution of sorts, I would think. And while we do wish you safe travels, and this is just another chapter, it would be remiss to say that your presence would not be missed. Again, I suppose on behalf of everyone here, we do genuinely thank you for everything that you've done. As a student of architecture, as a practitioner, I know firsthand a lot of the projects you've been involved in or given direction to. And they've really influenced a lot of us.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And on that note is probably when I should bring up the aForm tradition, which, as you probably know, is a question that's asked by one of our previous guests, not knowing who the next guest would be, which in this case was probably a good thing, because had they known you would be getting the question, it would be a lot of pressure. But let's pull up the question that you got. So the question that we have for you is, funnily enough, I think it's from someone you know, as fate would have it. If you could design for a place or a time that does not exist yet, what would it be and why? So I think if I can just read it out again. If you could design for a place or a time that doesn't exist yet, what would you design and why? So this could either be like super in the future or on another planet. I don't know. But if you could design for a place or a time that doesn't exist yet, what would it be and why?
I'm not sure. I'm someone who spent a lot of time looking at the past and applying lessons to the present, maybe not thought too much about the future. There's so much to think about in the present. And I'm not sure I can answer it other than to say that all I could do in designing it would be to bring the skills and experience that I've had, through my working life, working in very different environments, sometimes quite extreme, say moonscapes or, semi-tropical Africa, coastal situations and different. So architecture is about problem solving.
Yeah. And I think as long as you have your methodology in place,
that I could bring and apply to a completely alien situation in the future. I mean, I think that's what we're trained to do.
True.
So I'm sorry, I've rather avoided the question for giving you, but I'm not sure I can.
No, I think that's a pretty good answer, because it wouldn't really matter what it was or where it was. But I suppose if your foundational principles are the same, it would apply to pretty much any kind of project, right? So
I think so.
Yeah, that would make sense. So as we sort of reach the end of the episode, again, I know that I've mentioned it multiple times, but on behalf of obviously the entire aForm team, we thank you for coming on for yet another time. And hopefully, who knows, we might have you on for a third somewhere in Germany. You never know. Or on one of your visits back here. It's always fun to talk to you. Leaves me, at the very least, very inspired to do much better work. And yeah, thank you for everything that you've done. Thank you for coming on. The show is only possible because of people like yourself donating your time and being honest with your experiences and learnings. And hopefully someone listening takes those and makes the world a better place.
That's what it's about, making the world a better place.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And for the rest of you guys, we will catch you guys next week. Fellow aFormer, thank you so much for your time. If this episode added any value to you, please share it with anyone who may benefit. If you want to carry on the discussion, please get in touch with us over socials. We are at aForm Show on the gram and hello@aForm.studio on email. That is at aForm Show on the gram and hello@aForm.studio on email. Until next time, stay inspired.